Welcome to the first lesson on the next major topic for America making a superpower. We're going to talk about populism, progressivism, and imperialism over the next few lessons, talking about the period of American history between 1890 and 1920. A lot of things happen in this time, so we have to think about, for example, the First World War. We'll have to think about some of the other issues and political tensions that exist as we go into the new century, and we will have a lot of fun along the way, I imagine. And we're going to begin by talking about political tensions that existed in America in the 1890s, just sort of laying the groundwork for what the 1890s looked like. And if you have followed the Gilded Age period lessons, which I hope you have, you will have a basic understanding of what this period looks like, and we will get into it in more detail as time goes on. So, this period was a period of a growing level of populism, and we also see a reaction to the power and influence of big business and monopolistic enterprises, which of course plagued the Gilded Age period as we remember. And it also saw the perceived dominance of the industrial North in relation to the less industrial, more rural, should I say, agricultural South. This was an idea that was beginning to develop in the Gilded Age and was effectively becoming more and more true as time went on, as industrialization continues at a disparate rate between the North and the South. We'll talk about all this as time goes on. So let's think about big business. Let's think about the monopolistic enterprises that were growing and thinking about the attempts to try and reduce their influence with various antitrust legislation, the extent to which this was even effective, and talking about the impact that was had in terms of the societal impression of big business. There was a worry initially that the government was acting too weak. Why was this the case? Well, it was seen and correctly viewed, arguably, that the ill-equipped government was unable to deal with the power and influence of big businesses. They were unable to deal with, and in some cases unwilling to deal with, the power and influence of big business with their laissez-faire government policies. And even where they were attempting to interfere with the big business and the influence that they had, they were being very unsuccessful with it. Business interests often controlled government officials. There was a lot of lobbying that was incredibly corrupt, to the extent to which that we see not just lobbying influencing governments, but essentially controlling government officials and telling government officials what to do. It's an interesting reason why this man on this image here has a hat on that says monopoly written on it, and also oppression written in the smoke. There's a reason why this is the case. The Muckraking journalists felt that the answer to this problem was to reform the political system, and by reforming the political system we can see that they would have more tight grips over the growing influence of big businesses. So people like Ida Tarbell would write about the fact that there were unfair business practices being perpetuated by the likes of Standard Oil. If you remember back to previous lessons, Standard Oil was the oil company that was a monopoly over the oil market. They controlled over 90% of oil within the United States, considering effectively creating a monopoly within that industry. Other industries that were monopolistic were, for example, electricity, was sugar, which was controlled 98%. We also see major control by private railway firms, hence why the image on the screen there is so apt as well. In January 1903, the editors of McClure's magazine wrote an editorial where they attacked the powerful political and business interests. This is significant. You might think, well, this is just an editorial, this is just a magazine. Why is this so significant in terms of the history? Well, it's significant because it shows the backlash that was being had, not on the part of government, but on the part of the people. Individuals within society began to feel that they were not having their voices heard, and they began to feel that the big oil companies and big businesses that were essentially monopolies were having too much influence over both their own markets and also the political system as well. Now, I made mention in the last lesson of this idea of muckraking journalism. What does this actually refer to? Well, this was a term given to investigative journalism, investigative reporting. The term was coined, first used, should I say, when given to popular magazines such as McClure's and Collier's. And Collier's, these were individual magazines that were involved with the investigative reporting and investigating unfair business practices and corruption and political processes and political reform, all of these different things. This becomes known as muckraking journalism. Continuing then, let's think about how we look at business from not just the federal level, which contributes to the entire United States, but let's think about how business looked and operated at a local and state level as well. At local levels, reformers tried to mobilize grassroots supports in terms of trying to essentially reform business practices. They wanted to clear up inner city corruption. They wanted to clear up corruption within local, state, and federal government systems, starting within the cities. Local politicians paid by utility companies to give contracts in which they would charge high prices and offer poor services were one of the main elements that were essentially targeted by these new reformers who were trying to mobilize grassroots support. Because essentially when you have business in bed with government and with politicians, you see the fact that essentially they are able to instigate unfair practices and they're able to get legal reform to allow them to do so. So when we see that local politicians were paid by utility companies to give contracts in which they would charge high prices and offer poor services, you can see here that that would greatly benefit business, but would not benefit in any measurable way the consumer. They had a number of solutions, these reformers, these people who were trying to mobilize grassroots support. They set up a regulatory commission to oversee utilities companies and to oversee utilities industries and markets. They sought to elect town councils with professional officials, and by the early 1900s, over 400 urban councils had been reformed to these different standards. There was the idea of being able to reduce corruption, namely through opting to increase democracy, to allow for greater votes to be had in these regions and to allow for greater votes to be had at these levels, so local levels, for example. And of course, if you have more people having more of a say, they're going to vote against these ideas that are implemented by these big businesses, because obviously big businesses are not acting in the interests of the people. At the national level, we see less effective measures being implemented, mainly because of the size, scale, and monetary effectiveness that these businesses had at this national level, but also because of the fact that there was less of an impact that you would have as an individual at the national level. Many of the measures that were passed were relatively ineffective. For example, the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was hailed initially as the attack on the railroad monopolies of 1887, had no power to regulate rate from railroad companies, or not particularly great, so it meant that this was a workaround that the railroad companies were able to utilize. The Sherman Antitrust Act was also easily negated in law. Remember, the terms and provisions of the Sherman Antitrust Act were deliberately vague in order to allow for individuals to be able to work themselves around the provisions within the Act. It was also heavily reduced and diluted by the Supreme Court. So all of these things made the Sherman Antitrust Act, while very significant when it was passed in 1890, relatively ineffective in terms of its ability to see major significant change and reform to big business practices.